"Sir, please, my grandpa didn't steal anything." The little girl's voice trembled through the crowded mall food court, thin and fragile beneath the hum of conversations, clattering trays, and the distant echo of Christmas music drifting down from the second floor. People turned slowly. Some stopped chewing. Others lowered their phones just enough to watch without being noticed. Near the pharmacy counter, 72-year-old Elijah Brooks stood with both hands visible at his sides, his weathered denim jacket hanging loose over a faded gray sweater. A small paper bag containing insulin supplies rested near his feet beside a plastic shopping sack from the dollar store. Across from him stood Officer Ryan Keller, tall, broad-shouldered, his polished badge reflecting the harsh white overhead lights. Ryan's jaw was tight, his posture stiff with the confidence of a man used to controlling every room he entered. "Store security says you were seen pocketing merchandise," Ryan said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Elijah blinked once behind thin, silver-framed glasses. "Son, I paid for everything." His voice was calm, almost tired. Naomi clung to his arm immediately, her tiny winter boots squeaking against the tile floor as she looked nervously between the officer and her grandfather. She couldn't have been older than 9. Her curls were tied into uneven puffs beneath a pink knit hat, and her small fingers tightened around Elijah's sleeve like she was afraid someone might take him away. Ryan barely looked at her. "Then you won't mind emptying your pockets." Elijah glanced toward the growing crowd. A teenage employee stood frozen near the pretzel stand. 2 women whispered beside a smoothie kiosk. Somewhere above them, a drone-like announcement repeated a holiday sale no one was listening to anymore. Elijah slowly reached into his jacket and removed a folded receipt. His hands were steady, but the skin across his knuckles looked old and rough, marked by years of hard labor and colder seasons. Ryan snatched the receipt without thanks. "This doesn't prove anything." Naomi's eyes widened. "Grandpa paid already. I saw him." Ryan exhaled sharply through his nose, already irritated by the attention gathering around him. His body camera blinked blue against his chest. "Step back, sweetheart." Naomi obeyed instantly, though her eyes shimmered with panic. Elijah lowered his voice. "Officer, you're scaring her." Something about the sentence made Ryan's expression harden instead of soften. Maybe it was the calmness. Maybe it was the fact the old man refused to sound afraid. "You people always say that," Ryan muttered under his breath. A few heads turned faster at those words. Elijah's eyes lifted slowly. For the first time, there was something different in them. Not anger, not fear either, just disappointment, deep and heavy, like he had lived this exact moment too many times before. Naomi wrapped both arms around his waist. "Grandpa," Ryan stepped closer. "Hands where I can see them." Elijah obeyed again without argument. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished floor as silence spread wider through the food court. Even the cashiers nearby had stopped speaking. Ryan suddenly grabbed Elijah by the shoulder, shoving him backward against the edge of a table hard enough to rattle the trays sitting on top. Naomi cried out immediately. "Stop!" Elijah caught himself against the table without raising his hands. "Please," he said quietly, "don't do this in front of my granddaughter." But Ryan, flushed from the pressure of the watching crowd and the body cam recording every second, mistook calmness for resistance. In one quick motion, he struck Elijah across the face. The sound cracked through the mall like a snapped board. Elijah's glasses flew sideways across the tile floor, spinning beneath a nearby chair as the entire food court fell dead silent. For one long second, nobody moved. Elijah stood beside the table with his head slightly turned from the impact, his gray beard trembling faintly as he breathed through the sudden sting spreading across his cheek. Naomi stared in horror, her small hands shaking as tears rolled down her face. The old man slowly reached down and steadied himself against the edge of the chair beside him. Around them, the food court had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the sizzling grill from the cheesesteak counter seemed distant now. Ryan Keller straightened his uniform instinctively, chest rising with heavy breaths, as if he expected applause instead of silence. But the crowd looked uneasy now. A woman near the coffee stand lowered her phone with a frown. A father standing beside his teenage son quietly stepped backward. Elijah bent slowly at the waist, his movements careful and controlled, and picked up his glasses from beneath the chair. One lens had cracked through the middle. He studied the damage for a moment before slipping them back onto his face anyway. Naomi wrapped herself around his arm immediately. "Grandpa, let us go home," she whispered through tears. Elijah rested one trembling hand over hers. "It is all right, baby girl." His voice carried the kind of calm that only comes from surviving things most people could never imagine. Ryan looked irritated now, almost uncomfortable under the weight of the watching eyes. "You should have cooperated from the beginning," he snapped. Elijah lifted his gaze slowly toward the younger man. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected faintly against the fractured lens across his eye. "I did cooperate." Ryan opened his mouth again, but another voice suddenly interrupted from somewhere behind the crowd. "Officer Keller, maybe we should review the security footage first." It was one of the mall's security guards, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Carl, who looked visibly nervous stepping into the tension. Ryan barely turned toward him. "I have this under control." Carl hesitated. "Sir, the pharmacist already confirmed the insulin was purchased." A ripple moved quietly through the crowd. Elijah said nothing. Naomi pressed her face against his side, trying to hide from the staring strangers surrounding them. Ryan's jaw tightened hard enough to flex beneath his skin. Embarrassment began creeping beneath his confidence now, subtle but visible. Then why did the anti-theft alarm trigger? Carl swallowed awkwardly. It was a tagging error from another customer earlier. Silence spread again, heavier this time. Somewhere near the escalators, a child asked his mother what happened, but she pulled him away quickly without answering. Elijah looked down at Naomi. "You hungry?" he asked softly, as if none of this had happened. Naomi wiped her eyes and nodded weakly. The gentleness in his voice made several people lower their eyes in shame. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, aware now that dozens of phones were still pointed in his direction. His body camera continued blinking steadily against his chest. Elijah reached for the small paper pharmacy bag near his feet and carefully checked the insulin boxes inside. One had cracked open during the shove against the table. He exhaled quietly under his breath. Naomi noticed immediately. "Did it break?" Elijah forced a small smile. "Maybe a little." She looked devastated. "But you need that medicine." Elijah nodded once without complaint. Then he crouched slowly despite the stiffness in his knees and picked up the dollar store shopping bag that had spilled across the tile. Inside were simple things: bread, soup cans, peanut butter, a small pink notebook with glitter stars on the cover. Naomi's school notebook. The sight of it sitting among scattered groceries made the entire scene somehow feel smaller and sadder than before. Ryan watched the old man gather his things in silence. For the first time since approaching him, the officer seemed uncertain what to do next. But Elijah never raised his voice, never threatened him, never even looked angry. And somehow, that calmness unsettled Ryan far more than shouting ever could. The crowd should have moved on by then, but nobody did. People lingered near the food court tables pretending to sip drinks or check messages while quietly watching the old man gather his belongings from the floor. The mall lights reflected softly against the polished tiles, cold and pale beneath the giant hanging snowflakes suspended from the ceiling. Somewhere overhead, Bing Crosby still sang about a white Christmas, the cheerful music now feeling strangely distant from the tension sitting over the room. Elijah carefully placed the cracked insulin box back into the pharmacy bag and rose slowly to his feet. His knees stiffened slightly as he straightened, but he never complained. Naomi stood beside him, clutching the glitter-covered notebook against her chest. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ryan Keller with the wary expression of a child who had learned too early that uniforms did not always mean safety. Ryan could feel those eyes. He could feel all of them. The phones. The whispers. The judgment crawling quietly through the crowd around him. His face had begun turning red beneath the bright overhead lighting, but pride kept him rooted in place. "You can go," he muttered finally, though the words sounded more irritated than apologetic. Elijah adjusted the collar of his old denim jacket. "Thank you." Ryan frowned immediately at the calm response. No anger. No accusations. Somehow that made the entire situation worse. A younger officer arriving from the west entrance approached carefully, glancing between Ryan and the old man. "Everything good here?" Ryan answered too quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." But the younger officer noticed the cracked glasses. The frightened child. The groceries still scattered near the chair legs. His expression shifted subtly. Elijah reached down and handed Naomi her pink winter scarf that had slipped onto the floor during the confrontation. "You cold, baby girl?" Naomi shook her head, though her cheeks were still wet with tears. Elijah smiled softly anyway and wrapped the scarf around her himself, his rough fingers moving gently as if handling something precious. The small act seemed to affect the people watching more than the confrontation itself. An older woman near the smoothie counter pressed a hand against her mouth. A teenage boy quietly lowered his phone in embarrassment. Ryan noticed all of it. Every glance now felt heavier than before. "Sir," Carl the security guard said awkwardly. "The pharmacy offered to replace the damaged insulin." Elijah nodded politely. "I appreciate that." Then he reached into his pocket and slowly removed several folded $1 bills and loose quarters. Naomi looked up immediately. "Grandpa, you do not have to pay again." Elijah gave her a tired smile. "Nothing in life is free." The words landed harder than he intended. Ryan looked away briefly. Through the glass entrance doors near the parking lot, rain had started falling outside, thin streaks running down the windows beneath the gray Chicago sky. The food court lights reflected across the wet pavement beyond the mall entrance like blurred gold ribbons. Elijah gathered the grocery bags into one hand and reached for Naomi with the other. "Come on now. Let us get home before the buses slow down." Naomi nodded and slipped her hand into his immediately. They started toward the exit together, moving slowly through the silent crowd. Then something happened that Ryan did not expect. As Elijah passed him, the old man stopped for just a second. Not aggressively, not threatening. He simply looked directly into Ryan's eyes through the cracked lens resting crookedly on his face. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Ryan noticed something strange about the old man's posture. Even at 72, Elijah carried himself differently than most people his age. His shoulders stayed balanced. His movements remained controlled, calm, deliberate. There was no fear in him at all, only restraint. Then Elijah spoke quietly enough that only Ryan could hear. "You should learn the difference between danger and dignity, son." Ryan felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Before he could answer, Naomi tugged gently at her grandfather's sleeve, and together they walked toward the rain-soaked mall entrance while the entire food court watched them leave in silence. Rain tapped softly against the massive glass windows as Elijah and Naomi stepped out of the mall and into the cold Chicago evening. The city smelled like wet pavement, bus exhaust, and distant smoke drifting from food carts parked along the curb. Naomi walked close beside her grandfather beneath the faded green umbrella he carried in one hand. The umbrella leaned slightly from age, one metal spoke bent crooked near the top, but Elijah held it carefully over her anyway while his own shoulder absorbed most of the rain. Behind them, through the glowing mall entrance, people still stood watching. Some whispered. Some stared at Officer Ryan Keller. Others quietly replayed videos on their phones. But Elijah never looked back. Naomi finally spoke once they reached the covered bus stop near the edge of the parking lot. "Grandpa, why did he do that?" Elijah lowered himself slowly onto the damp bench beneath the shelter roof. His joints stiffened visibly as he sat. He placed the grocery bags carefully beside his boots before answering. "Some people see fear before they see humanity." Naomi frowned slightly. "But you were nice to him." Elijah looked out toward the rain sliding across the black asphalt. "That does not always matter." The little girl fell quiet after that. Across the street, headlights blurred through the storm while traffic crawled slowly through the evening rush. A city bus hissed to a stop farther down the block, releasing tired passengers beneath clouds of steam rising from the wet road. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver watch wrapped carefully in cloth. The cracked lens in his glasses caught the reflection of the streetlights as he examined it. Tiny gears rested beside the watch face inside the cloth bundle. Naomi leaned closer immediately. "Are you fixing Mrs. Carter's watch tonight?" Elijah nodded once. "She wants to wear it for church Sunday." Naomi smiled faintly for the first time since the mall. "You always fix everybody's stuff." Elijah chuckled softly under his breath. "Not always." But Naomi knew better. Their tiny apartment above the laundromat was filled with clocks, watches, radios, and broken kitchen timers people brought to Elijah because replacing things cost more than repairing them. He rarely charged much, sometimes not at all, especially for elderly neighbors, especially for single mothers. Naomi watched her grandfather's fingers carefully adjust one tiny gear inside the watch mechanism even while cold rain drifted through the shelter opening beside them. His hands looked old, but they never shook when working, never hesitated. Every movement stayed precise and calm. Across town, Officer Ryan Keller sat alone inside his patrol SUV beneath the parking garage outside the mall. Rainwater streaked slowly down the windshield while the heater hummed quietly inside the vehicle. The body camera footage had already been uploaded automatically to department servers. His phone buzzed nonstop on the passenger seat beside him. Texts from coworkers, notifications, messages from supervisors asking what happened. Ryan ignored them all. He could still hear the crack of the old man's glasses hitting the tile floor. Still hear the little girl crying. But more than anything, he kept hearing that sentence. You should learn the difference between danger and dignity. Ryan rubbed a hand across his jaw and stared through the windshield. Something about Elijah Brooks unsettled him deeply now. Not because the old man had challenged him, because he had not. Most people shouted when embarrassed, protested when afraid. Elijah had done neither. The old man had stood there calm beneath humiliation, like someone who had survived far worse things than public shame. Ryan suddenly noticed his own hands were trembling slightly against the steering wheel. He flexed them once and looked away in frustration. Back at the bus stop, Naomi slowly rested her head against Elijah's shoulder. Grandpa, were you scared back there? Elijah looked down at her small face beneath the pink winter hat. For several seconds, he said nothing. Rain drummed softly above them, while distant sirens echoed through the city. Then finally, he answered in the quietest voice. No, baby girl. Naomi blinked sleepily. Why not? Elijah's eyes drifted toward the dark streets ahead, distant and unreadable beneath the flickering bus stop light. Because fear stopped controlling me a very long time ago. The bus arrived nearly 20 minutes late, its headlights glowing through the rain like blurred white halos against the dark Chicago street. Elijah helped Naomi climb aboard first before carefully lifting the grocery bags with one hand and steadying himself against the rail with the other. The warmth inside the bus smelled faintly of wet coats, old vinyl seats, and engine oil. Most passengers looked exhausted after long shifts downtown. Nobody paid much attention to the elderly man and little girl moving quietly toward the back row until Naomi noticed two teenagers staring at Elijah's cracked glasses. She lowered her eyes immediately and scooted closer beside him. Elijah sat carefully by the fogged window and rested the grocery bags at his feet. Water dripped slowly from the edge of his jacket onto the rubber floor beneath the seat. Outside, rain slid across storefront windows while traffic lights reflected in long red streaks across the pavement. Naomi leaned against him again, half asleep now from the long day. Grandpa, she whispered softly. Yes, baby girl. Did you ever want to hit him back? Elijah stayed quiet for several seconds. The bus rattled through an intersection while distant thunder rolled somewhere over Lake Michigan. Finally, he answered. Wanting and doing are not always the same thing. Naomi looked up at him. But he hurt you. Elijah nodded once. Yes. Then why did you stay calm? Elijah's tired eyes drifted toward the rain outside the window. Because once anger takes control, everybody loses. Naomi seemed to think about that carefully before resting her head back against his arm. She trusted him completely. That was the part Elijah feared losing most. Not his dignity, not the cracked glasses, not even the humiliation inside the mall. It was her trust. The old man slowly rubbed his thumb against the silver watch still wrapped in cloth inside his pocket. The tiny ticking sound grounded him the same way it always had. Precision, rhythm, control. Three things that had once kept men alive. Across town, Ryan Keller sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen in the dim glow of his apartment. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while his untouched takeout food sat growing cold beside him. The body cam footage had already leaked online. Thousands of views in less than an hour. Comments flooded beneath the clips faster than Ryan could read them. Some defended him. Most did not. One slowed video showed the old man quietly picking up Naomi's school notebook from the mall floor while the little girl cried beside him. Ryan paused the video there. Something twisted painfully in his stomach. He slammed the laptop shut, exhaling sharply through his nose. But the silence in the apartment only made things worse. Because now he could hear the moment clearly in his own head. You touched the wrong veteran, son. Ryan frowned. Veteran. He had missed that word earlier inside the chaos of the food court. He opened the laptop again and replayed the footage carefully. The old man's posture. His balance. The calmness under pressure. Ryan suddenly noticed something else too. Elijah had never once flinched before being struck. Not once. Like fear itself had been trained out of him years ago. Ryan leaned back slowly in his chair. Then his phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. Sergeant Mitchell. Ryan hesitated before answering. Sir. The older man sounded exhausted already. Internal Affairs wants statements tomorrow morning. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. Understood. There was a pause. Then Mitchell spoke again, quieter this time. Keller. Who exactly was that old man? Ryan stared at the paused image on his laptop screen. Elijah stood there beneath the harsh mall lights holding grocery bags in one hand while shielding Naomi with the other. Even frozen in low-resolution footage, there was something disciplined about him. Controlled. Familiar somehow. I do not know, Ryan admitted finally. Sergeant Mitchell exhaled heavily. Well, somebody online already does. Ryan's stomach tightened instantly. What do you mean? Another pause. Rain hammered harder against the apartment windows now. Then Mitchell answered in a voice that sounded far more serious than before. A retired Army colonel just commented under the video. Ryan sat upright slowly. And the sergeant lowered his voice. He says your old man might be former Delta Force. The apartment above the laundromat rattled softly every time the industrial dryers downstairs spun into another cycle. Warm air carrying the scent of detergent drifted faintly through the floor vents while rain continued tapping against the narrow windows overlooking the alley outside. Elijah sat alone at the small kitchen table long after Naomi had fallen asleep on the pull-out couch nearby. A single lamp illuminated the room with a tired amber glow, casting long shadows across shelves crowded with broken clocks, tiny screwdrivers, and old coffee tins filled with watch parts. The cracked lens in Elijah's glasses rested beside him now, while he carefully repaired the bent frame using a miniature tool kit spread across the table. His hands moved with patient precision despite the redness still lingering faintly along his cheek. Across the room, Naomi slept curled beneath a faded blue blanket, clutching her glitter notebook against her chest like something precious. Elijah glanced toward her every few seconds without even realizing he was doing it. Protection had become instinct long ago. Outside, distant sirens echoed through the wet Chicago streets before fading again into the night. Elijah finally leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, the apartment disappeared. Rain became helicopter blades. Dryer vibrations became distant artillery. The soft, flickering kitchen light became desert fire against black sky. His breathing slowed carefully. Controlled. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same rhythm drilled into him decades earlier beneath brutal heat and heavier silence. Then suddenly Naomi stirred on the couch. Grandpa. Elijah opened his eyes instantly. I am here, baby girl. Her sleepy voice drifted softly through the darkness. Did you have the bad dream again? Elijah looked down at his rough hands resting on the kitchen table. Just an old memory. Naomi pushed herself upright slightly beneath the blanket. Mom used to say memories only hurt because they mattered. Elijah's expression softened immediately at the mention of his daughter. A framed photograph rested near the lamp beside him. Naomi's mother smiling beneath summer sunlight years before illness hollowed her body thin. Elijah reached over and gently straightened the frame. Your mother was smarter than me. Naomi smiled sleepily. That is because she was your daughter. Elijah chuckled quietly under his breath, the sound low and warm inside the dim apartment. Then his eyes drifted back toward the rain-covered window. Somewhere across the city, strangers were still watching clips of him online without knowing his story. They saw an old black man in a mall, a frightened little girl, a police officer losing control. But they did not see the years before that moment. The sacrifices, the funerals, the men he never forgot. Elijah slowly opened the small wooden drawer beneath the table and removed an old military challenge coin worn smooth around the edges. A faded insignia rested at its center beneath scratches gathered over decades. He rolled the coin quietly between his fingers while dryer vibrations hummed beneath the apartment floor. Across town, Ryan Keller sat awake in the dark glow of his laptop screen while video after video flooded social media. News accounts had started reposting clips from the mall. Reporters called it excessive force. Others called it racial profiling. But one video stopped Ryan cold. A retired military account had uploaded an old photograph beside the mall footage. The younger version of Elijah stood surrounded by soldiers in desert camouflage beneath a faded American flag. Leaner then, harder, but unmistakably the same eyes. The caption beneath the image read, Sergeant First Class Elijah Brooks. Delta Force. Mogadishu veteran. Silver Star recipient. Ryan stared at the screen as heat slowly drained from his face. The room suddenly felt too small around him. His chest tightened unexpectedly while memories replayed in brutal detail. The cracked glasses. Naomi crying. The calmness. Dear God. Ryan leaned forward slowly, staring at the old photograph again. Even surrounded by armed men decades earlier, Elijah carried the exact same expression he had worn in the food court tonight. Steady, controlled, unshaken. Ryan swallowed hard. For the first time since joining the police department, shame settled fully into his chest without resistance. Not because the old man had once been dangerous, but because he had chosen not to be. By sunrise, the story had spread far beyond Chicago. News clips played inside airport terminals, barbershops, diners, and police precinct break rooms across the country. Every station showed the same frozen image over and over again. An elderly black man standing quietly beneath harsh mall lighting with a frightened little girl beside him and cracked glasses resting crooked across his face. But now another image appeared beside it. A faded military photograph taken nearly 30 years earlier in Somalia. Younger soldiers covered in dust and exhaustion stood shoulder to shoulder beneath brutal desert sunlight, and near the center stood a younger Elijah Brooks wearing desert camouflage and the same unreadable calm in his eyes. The anchor spoke differently now. Not suspicious. Respectful. Retired Delta Force veteran. Decorated war hero. Silver Star recipient. Saved multiple soldiers during the Battle of Mogadishu. The words rolled through television speakers all morning long, while social media exploded with reactions. Veterans began posting stories of Elijah online. One former Army medic described Elijah carrying wounded men through gunfire despite injuries to his own leg. Another wrote that Sergeant Brooks was known for one thing above all else: restraint. Back inside the small apartment above the laundromat, Elijah sat near the kitchen window repairing Mrs. Carter's silver watch exactly as promised. The morning light filtering through the rain clouds painted soft gray shadows across the crowded workbench. Naomi sat at the tiny table beside him eating cereal, while an old radio quietly played jazz somewhere near the sink. Neither of them had turned the television on. Grandpa, Naomi asked between bites. Miss Linda downstairs said people on the internet are calling you a hero. Elijah adjusted a tiny spring inside the watch mechanism without looking up. People online say many things. Naomi tilted her head thoughtfully. Were you really in the army? Elijah smiled faintly. A long time ago. Did you save people? The old man paused briefly, then returned to his work. Sometimes. Naomi stared at him with growing wonder, as if she were suddenly realizing her quiet grandfather had lived entire lifetimes before she was born. Before she could ask another question, a knock echoed softly through the apartment. Elijah's expression shifted instantly. Calm. Alert. Not fearful. Just aware. He stood carefully from the chair and walked toward the door while Naomi watched curiously from the table. When Elijah opened it, Sergeant Daniel Mitchell stood outside in plain clothes beneath the dim hallway light. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his coat. He removed his cap immediately out of respect. Mr. Brooks. Elijah studied him quietly. Can I help you? Mitchell swallowed once before speaking. I came regarding Officer Keller. Naomi immediately lowered her spoon. Elijah opened the door wider without a word. Mitchell stepped carefully inside, glancing briefly around the modest apartment filled with clocks, repaired radios, and stacked books worn from age. The laundromat dryers vibrated softly beneath the floorboards. You have a nice place, Mitchell said awkwardly. Elijah motioned toward the kitchen table. Coffee. The offer caught Mitchell off guard. Yes, sir. Thank you. Naomi watched silently as her grandfather poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug with steady hands. Mitchell noticed the cracked glasses resting near the workbench and lowered his eyes briefly. Shame flickered across his face. Mr. Brooks, he began carefully, the department has placed Officer Keller on administrative leave pending investigation. Elijah nodded once, but said nothing. Mitchell cleared his throat. There is also something else. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a folded photograph. Elijah recognized it instantly before Mitchell even set it down. Mogadishu, 1993. Dust. Smoke. Young men trying desperately to survive another sunrise. Mitchell looked at him with open respect now. My father served with the Rangers over there, he said quietly. He said your team got them out alive. Elijah stared at the old photograph for several long seconds. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back. Your father remembers too kindly. Mitchell shook his head slowly. No, sir. I do not think he does. Across the room, Naomi looked between the two men in complete silence while morning rain slid softly down the apartment windows behind them. The rain finally stopped sometime after noon, leaving the city wrapped in that strange silver quiet that follows a storm. Water still dripped from fire escapes and telephone wires outside the laundromat, while weak sunlight pushed through the clouds in pale streaks across the alley. Elijah sat near the apartment window repairing the final gear inside Mrs. Carter's watch when another knock sounded at the door. This time it was softer, hesitant. Naomi looked up from the coloring book spread across the floor beside the couch. Elijah already knew who stood outside before he even opened the door. Officer Ryan Keller waited in the dim hallway wearing plain clothes instead of a uniform. No badge, no radio, no gun visible at his waist. Just jeans, a dark coat damp from melted snow, and exhaustion written heavily across his face. His eyes immediately dropped when Elijah opened the door. Mr. Brooks. Elijah studied him quietly for several long seconds. Naomi stood slowly near the couch, uncertainty crossing her face the moment she recognized him. Ryan noticed immediately. The shame in his expression deepened. I know I probably should not be here, he said carefully, but I needed to come myself. Elijah stepped aside without a word. Ryan entered slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid the tiny apartment itself might reject him. The humming dryers beneath the floor vibrated softly through the room, while jazz music played faintly from the kitchen radio. Ryan's eyes drifted across the shelves crowded with repaired clocks and old photographs before settling briefly on the framed picture of Naomi's mother beside the lamp. Elijah motioned toward the small kitchen table. Sit down. Ryan obeyed immediately. Naomi remained near the couch, clutching her coloring book against her chest. Ryan looked toward her carefully. Hi, Naomi. She did not answer. Elijah sat across from him calmly, his repaired glasses now resting properly on his face again. Sunlight touched the cracked lines still visible through one lens. Ryan swallowed hard before speaking. I watched the footage again last night. Elijah said nothing. Ryan rubbed his palms together nervously. There is no excuse for what I did. The apartment stayed quiet except for the ticking clocks scattered across the shelves. I thought I knew what danger looked like, Ryan continued quietly. But the truth is, I walked into that mall already seeing you as a threat before you even spoke. Elijah's expression never changed. Ryan looked down at his hands. And your granddaughter had to watch all of it. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the floor. The guilt in Ryan's voice no longer sounded rehearsed now. It sounded heavy. Human. I embarrassed myself, he admitted. But worse than that, I scared a little girl who was only trying to protect her grandfather. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the younger man carefully. Why are you really here, son? Ryan looked up slowly. For the first time since entering the apartment, his eyes were completely honest. Because after I found out who you were, I realized something. Elijah waited quietly. Ryan exhaled shakily. A man who survived everything you survived still treated me with more restraint than I treated you. The words settled heavily through the small apartment. Naomi looked toward her grandfather now instead of Ryan. Elijah remained silent for several moments while sunlight flickered softly against the old clocks lining the shelves behind him. Then finally he spoke. You think being Delta Force is the important part of this story? Ryan frowned slightly. No, sir. Elijah's tired eyes rested calmly on him. Good. Because it is not. Ryan lowered his gaze again. Elijah folded his rough hands together atop the kitchen table. The important part is what Naomi learns from all this. Naomi looked up immediately. Elijah turned toward her softly. Baby girl, come here. She walked slowly across the apartment and climbed gently into the chair beside him. Elijah rested one hand over hers before looking back at Ryan. Children remember how adults handle power, he said quietly. Especially when they are frightened. Ryan nodded once, unable to argue. The old man studied him another long moment before speaking again. You made a mistake. Ryan's jaw tightened painfully. Yes, sir. Elijah nodded slowly. Then make sure it teaches you something worth carrying. 3 weeks later, the city had already moved on to newer headlines. Another scandal. Another viral clip. Another storm of outrage flooding screens before disappearing just as quickly. But inside the small apartment above the laundromat, life settled back into its quiet rhythm one careful day at a time. On a cold Sunday afternoon, pale winter sunlight drifted softly through the windows while Elijah sat near the radiator repairing an old grandfather clock brought in by a neighbor from 2 blocks away. Tiny gears rested across the table beside neatly arranged tools, and the steady ticking of repaired watches filled the apartment with calm, patient sound. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, finishing homework, while jazz music played low through the old kitchen radio. The world outside still buzzed occasionally with strangers discussing Elijah Brooks online, but inside the apartment none of that seemed to matter much anymore. Elijah preferred it that way. A folded letter from the Chicago Police Department rested unopened near the edge of the table beside his coffee mug. Naomi glanced toward it curiously. You are never going to read that? Elijah smiled faintly without looking up from the clock mechanism. I already know what it says. Naomi tilted her head. How? Elijah adjusted a tiny brass spring with steady fingers. People who feel guilty usually use too many words. Naomi laughed softly beneath her breath. The sound warmed the room more than the radiator ever could. Outside the apartment window, snow had finally begun falling in slow, delicate flakes across the alley behind the building. Children's voices echoed faintly from somewhere down the block, while car tires hissed along wet streets below. Elijah paused briefly and listened to the sound. Peace. Real peace always sounded small. Not loud like television. Not dramatic like war stories or internet fame. Just clocks ticking. Snow falling. A child laughing in the next room. Another knock sounded gently at the apartment door. Naomi looked up immediately. Elijah already recognized the rhythm of it now. Come in, he called calmly. Ryan Keller stepped inside, carrying a small cardboard box beneath one arm. He looked different than before. Lighter somehow. Not because life had become easier, but because something arrogant inside him had finally broken open. Afternoon, Ryan said quietly. Naomi smiled politely this time, instead of hiding behind furniture. Hi. Ryan carefully set the box down near the kitchen table. The pharmacy downstairs donated these for you, he explained. Insulin supplies. They said your insurance should have covered the replacement weeks ago. Elijah looked at the box for several seconds before nodding once. Thank you. Ryan glanced around the apartment at the ticking clocks and warm lamplight. I still do not know how you stay this calm all the time. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair. You think calm comes naturally? Ryan shrugged awkwardly. Does it not? Elijah smiled faintly and looked toward the falling snow outside the window. No, son. Calm is something you practice after surviving enough storms. Ryan lowered his eyes thoughtfully. The old man returned his attention to the grandfather clock resting open before him. Tiny brass gears reflected softly beneath the amber light, while his weathered hands moved with patient precision. Naomi wandered toward the window and pressed her hand lightly against the cold glass, watching snowflakes drift through the alley below. Grandpa, she asked quietly, do you think people can really change? Elijah glanced first toward Ryan, then toward the child standing by the window. His expression softened beneath the warm light filling the room. Only if they decide truth matters more than pride. The apartment fell quiet again after that. No speeches. No dramatic ending. Just the soft ticking of repaired clocks carrying steadily through the room while snow drifted silently across the city outside. Elijah adjusted one final gear inside the old clock, listened carefully to the restored rhythm begin again, and smiled almost invisibly to himself as time moved forward.